On the 3rd of February, here in my home state of Ohio, there was a train derailment out in the boonies transpiring in a small village by the name of East Palestine. It was a 150-car derailment, of which 20 of the train's cars were carrying vinyl chloride, benzene, and a number of other toxic cancer-causing chemicals that have now been released into the surrounding atmosphere, in large part due to the Norfolk Southern Railroad Company's decision to deliberately burn the derailed train cars, despite being warned by officials that the so-called controlled burn would release phosgene and hydrogen chloride into the atmosphere, both of which are incredibly toxic chemicals that were used as weapons during the First World War. Of course, Norfolk Southern only claims that they burned the train cars for public safety, alleging that there would have been a violent explosion had they not. But instead of taking their time to thoroughly clean up the mess and transferring the contents of the train cars to a safe container, they instead opted to clear the wreckage in the most lazy but cost-effective way that they could by burning it so that they could get back to business-as-usual operations as fast as humanly possible, albeit at the cost of jeopardizing the health and safety of everyone within a 100-mile radius. The so-called controlled burn took place over the span of about a week, releasing a mushroom cloud of smoke visible from outer space full of vinyl chloride, butyl acrylate, benzene, phosgene, and various other toxic carcinogens into the atmosphere. Of course, the local government put up an evacuation notice as to get everyone a clear, safe distance from the fire, despite the fact that in the wake of this controlled burn, residents are now reporting that all of their farm animals have died, despite thousands of dead fish being found floating belly up in the surrounding lakes and rivers. The EPA is here reassuring everyone that it's safe to go home, that the water is drinkable, that the air is breathable, and that no significant vinyl chloride has been detected outside or inside anyone's homes. Ohio EPA Director and energy company lobbyist Schill and Vogel promises us that despite the fact that 20 train cars worth of toxic chemicals have just been dumped into the habitat, that everything is just happy, hairy, hunky-dory. Quote, "The Ohio River is very large, and its water supply is able to dilute the pollutants very quickly. We're pretty confident that these low levels are not getting passed on to the consumer," unquote. Naturally, the residents of East Palestine are highly skeptical of the EPA's claims of safety, and in a recent town hall meeting, people have been reporting feelings of sickness and poor health since the evacuation notice has been lifted and they were permitted to go home. On Wednesday night, hundreds of East Palestine residents crowded into the high school gym to press state and local officials for answers about air and water testing and the risk of long-term exposure. "Why are people getting sick if there's nothing in the air or in the water?" one resident shouted to thunderous applause. The meeting was originally meant to include representatives from Norfolk Southern, but a few hours before the meeting had begun, the railroad company pulled out, saying in a statement that it had become concerned about a growing physical threat to employees and members of the community. Let's not kid ourselves, people. The ecocidal equivalent of a nuclear warhead has just been dropped out in the Ohio countryside, and now its toxic, biohazardous contaminants are both airborne and waterborne and detectable for hundreds of miles. You would think that there would be more media outlets talking about the fact that 20 train cars worth of toxic chemicals have just been released into the wild, instead of spending weeks at a time covering the complete non-story of a supposed spy balloon sent by the Chinese to do something. Needless to say, in the wake of this catastrophe, the Norfolk Southern Railway Company and the police and the local governments have all been doing what they do best: sketchy shit. News Nation journalist Evan Lambert, who was investigating on the ground, was arrested and jailed by the police last Wednesday at the press conference in East Palestine. And this isn't the first time this sort of thing has happened either. At the apex of the anti-racist George Floyd protests, the police had on numerous occasions arrested the media on bogus charges as well. If this really is a non-issue, if what the EPA says is true and we can all forget about this and go back to carrying on with our normal everyday lives, why has the situation now escalated to the point to where private journalists are now being arrested for doing too much snooping for the state's liking? Why is it that the media appears to be too busy chasing balloons to talk about this incident and its ramifications, considering the fact that its fallout can be felt by everyone across the state of Ohio and beyond? Could it be that there is a degree of foul play transpiring before our very eyes? Of course there is. And this isn't the first time Norfolk Southern has compromised public health and safety to pad their bottom line either. In 2016, Norfolk Southern, along with the rest of the railway industry, pumped $6 billion into the Republican Party and the Trump administration as to kill Obama-era regulations requiring all rail cars carrying hazardous materials to be equipped with modernized, state-of-the-art electronic braking rather than the conventional air brakes based on technology that hasn't been updated in over a century. And despite the fact that Norfolk Southern had boasted that the new braking mechanism had the potential to cut train stopping distances in half, they still opted to lobby and kill the regulation in the water so that they could cut corners on implementing new expensive train brakes. Well, those new train brakes sure would have come in handy in preventing this recent railway accident in East Palestine, now wouldn't have they? Too bad the railway industry evidently feels that the short-term costs of upgrading their train brakes outweighs the long-term financial, ecological, and human costs accrued due to greater frequency in train accidents. Fun fact: here in the United States we average over 1,000 train derailments per year, with there being more than 12,400 recorded derailments in the last decade alone. Why is it that in an era where we can split the atom and send people to outer space that we average as many trail derailments as we do? Well, the main reason is due to our reliance on ancient train technology that hasn't been updated for well over a century. That is to say, the trains that we are using now are largely the same as the trains we were using over 100 years ago. And so why haven't we expanded or modernized our railway system? Because to do so would yield no immediate short-term payoff for investors, cost an absolute fortune which would necessitate a tax increase, as well as expanding the role of the government in the economy. And the ruling class of this country don't want that. Even if updating our railway system would put the whole country to work, massively increase productivity, and substantially curtail the annual number of train derailments. But for the same reason the railway industry lobbies the government to repeal even the barest milquetoast regulations on their operations. For the same reason that we won't ever modernize our railway system. For the same reason that Norfolk Southern opted to burn the hazardous chemicals instead of properly disposing of them. At first glance, one might say the railway industry is wildly incompetent or stupid, or that these aren't deliberate choices being made by malicious actors. But I assure you, they are. While none of these choices make sense from a rational, pro-human standpoint, they make perfect sense from a cost-cutting standpoint, an exploitation standpoint, a profit-maximizing standpoint. When you start to consider their motivations from the lens of what they are willing to do to protect their bottom line, all of these decisions start to make perfect sense, even if at first glance they don't. It's the same reason why Flint, Michigan still doesn't have clean drinking water, the same reason why we have no pandemic response, no national healthcare plan, no human services, no public transit, and no public housing to speak of, but at the same time we have a huge, well-armed and militarized police force, a gigantic military of world conquest proportions, 800 military bases across the globe, and a prison industrial complex housing millions of inmates as we speak. Contrary to popular opinion, capitalism isn't designed with public health or human need in mind. It's designed to maximize profits in the short term for a minority of wealthy investors, which includes privatizing the gains made by industry, externalizing the costs onto the general public as much as possible, and then utilizing its armies both domestically and abroad to suppress workers' uprisings wherever and whenever they occur. That is, when it's not also utilizing its politicians and propagandists that also happen to be on the bankroll of the ruling class to manipulate the general public and to lull them into a false sense of normality. And as the taxpayer, despite the fact that the police and the local government are literally working off our dime, their true allegiance lies to the large corporations and their business interests. So if it seems like the government and Norfolk Southern appear to be colluding with one another to downplay and otherwise cover up this catastrophe, that's because they are. Again, companies are constantly seeking ways to maximize the rate of exploitation while externalizing their operational costs and usual fuck-ups onto the public. Meanwhile, the environmental regulation agencies that are meant to serve as watchdogs on behalf of the taxpayer are utterly compromised and bought out by the very same industries that they're supposed to be regulating. And the police are just there to terrorize, brutalize, browbeat, and otherwise violently repress the public if they dare to make too much noise about it. This is class warfare. Know who your real enemy is. That is the capitalists, the investors, the landlords, and the billionaires. They are well organized. They recognize their material interests, they stand in solidarity with one another, and they are highly class conscious. And that's why they're winning. The reason why they're winning the class war and why we're losing is because they're organized, we are not. They recognize their material class interests. Most workers don't. They stand in solidarity with one another, while the working class is divided and kept divided, and they are highly class conscious. And in order to turn things around, the working class needs to begin cultivating class consciousness of its own. The good news is that there is hope, and the situation isn't as dire as it seems on the surface. We have a number of advantages on our side. We, as working people, outnumber the capitalists by orders of magnitude, for one, and for two, we're the ones that actually run society and make it all possible. Workers make the world go round. We cook the food, we drive the trucks, we pave the roads, we deliver the packages, we assemble the products, we stock the shelves, we run the hospitals, and we fly the airplanes. Every brick that you see paved into the walls beside you is there because a worker put it there, and the solution to this problem entails working people realizing the power that they hold, getting organized on their own terms, and fighting for their class interests. Remember, their whole game depends on us being confused and divided and feeling as though we are powerless. They depend on your fear, they depend on your ignorance and your apathy, they don't want you knowing how badly they're fucking everyone over, and they certainly don't want you thinking about it either. Because if enough of us realize what's going on and muster the political will to come together, we have the power to overcome their system and establish a new one based on meeting human need in an environmentally sustainable manner. Historically, whenever the working class manages to gain class consciousness, come together in solidarity, as well as organizing and fighting on its own terms, the vast majority of the time, it is the workers that win. The ruling class knows this, which is why they pump billions of dollars per year propagandizing everyone as to keep them confused, afraid, and divided amongst themselves. So this is a call to action. If you're not currently in a socialist org, join an org. If you're currently not involved in mutual aid, establish mutual aid. Get involved within the local politics of your area, find out where the class struggle is transpiring, and participate in said class struggle. If you're not currently reading Marxist theory, I highly recommend that you start. We have a lot of important work to do, and it's time we rise above the bullshit. That's all I have to say for now. Now get out there, agitate, educate, and organize.